Most people think of components as the thing that you create after you've figured out your designs. But I'm going to suggest that components are actually one of the most effective ways to explore new designs. So instead of saving them until the very end of my design process, I often create components as the very first step when I'm testing out new UI. It can be scary at first, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a powerful workflow. Let's dive in. To start, let's talk about when I will use this workflow. If I'm designing a page layout that has repeating instances of a component, so maybe there's a grid of cards, or maybe I'm designing a table row or something like that, this is when I will consider using components as the very first step in my iteration process. Because as I'm tweaking this design, I want to be able to make changes in a single place and see those changes reflect throughout the entire page layout. If I'm making those visual updates in more than one place repeatedly, that's when it's kind of a red flag to me, and I'll start to think about how I can streamline this iteration process using components. So this lesson is going to pretty much be me building UI, and then you can get a sense for how I will really use components to drive that process forward. I gave myself a few starting atoms just to save some of the manual work, but for the most part, I'm going to do this completely from scratch so that you can get a sense for the whole process. So let's say I'm going to make a card grid. My first step is actually going to be creating a component. I'll call it card. And for this grid, I'm going to design different classroom cards so you can kind of get a sense for how that looks. So I have my main component right away. I'm going to duplicate that a few times, use auto layout to throw it into a row like so. And then I'll duplicate the row, use auto layout again to create a grid. So now I can play around with the spacing, and I have my basic setup already. So now when I make this change, you'll be able to see it populate everywhere. So let's give it a nice gradient to start. And we'll round the corners, maybe give it a little bit of an opacity border. Okay, let's start adding our text now. I'm going to call this biology, and you can see that's populating everywhere, so I can get a sense for how this is looking within the grid as I'm designing, which is super helpful. I'm going to insert an icon here. And I'm realizing right away that I want this to be higher contrast, so I'll do it like that. Make this white. Okay, I also have this progress bar here, so I will drop that in. And then I'm going to include some information about the instructor as well. So I'm just going to make a quick little circle, make that an image. I'm going to name that image, and you'll see why in a second. And then maybe this is P4, drop the opacity a little bit. I'm going to rename this to name, and that's going to allow me to grab all of those letters and override those changes all at once. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. All right, so I have some basic updates here. I like the width of these cards. I think I'm going to set the whole thing to an auto layout so I have a little bit more control over things. And I'm going to set that to fixed width. Let's just make it 320. Hug contents. Let's decrease the space in between these. Perfect. Okay, awesome. So I want these cards to be different colors. I want them to have icon overrides, and each of these cards is going to represent a different classroom. So I'm going to make those overrides now. So right away, you know I need to have some kind of a fill container up here. I'm going to set this text to fill container. Okay. Let's change the padding of this whole card to be 32. And so I'm running into a little bit of an issue here with the names. On one hand, I could set each card to fill container within the row, but I don't love that because I want this teacher information to be in the same place. So let's try doing space between. That's okay. I also think I want the progress bar in the same place though. So I'm actually going to group this progress bar and the teacher info into a bottom. And we can tighten that. Yeah, that's looking a little bit better. All right, let's do some quick color overrides. Just going to use my pre-built Figma Academy colors here. Perfect. Probably have to do some work on the contrast. That's okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to get some data into this teacher name and this avatar really quickly. And this is why I named my layers, because I use a plugin called Select Layers, and you can do Select Layers Name, and I'll just search image. And now once I have the images selected, I'm going to run the Content Reel plugin, and I can come in here and grab some avatars to automatically populate them within my designs, just like that, and I have a bunch of unique images. So I'm going to do the same thing on this name layer here. So I'm going to do Select Layers, Name, change this to Name. All right, and then I'll come into Content Reel and grab some full names. All right, perfect. So you can see how quickly you can get through something like this. And from here, it's all about making those little changes and seeing them reflect everywhere. Like maybe I want my progress bar to be full width. I could realize, you know what, actually, I kind of want an arrow. So I can drop an arrow into this design, and let's put it in this top row with the icon. So I'm going to Shift A to make an auto layout, call that row, flip the flex direction, set it to fill container, space between, and then I'll probably add a little bit of padding around this. So I hit Shift A to create a wrapper for it. And then you can come down here. Let's make that a little bit lighter. Perfect. And now for one last thing, let's say that I want to put some kind of a gradient effect on these colors while preserving my layer styles, because some of these lighter colors don't really look that accessible. So let's do that really quickly. I'm going to tighten this. And what I'm actually going to do is remove the padding at this parent level right here, because I want to put an overlay frame on top of the card. So what I'm going to do is get rid of this. And now in my child containers here, I'm going to add the padding at that level. So I'll add 32 here, 32 here. Perfect. And now I'm going to create an overlay. And the issue with auto layout is that it's going to push down all of my content. So I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Command Option G to wrap this in a frame. Now that frame, I'm going to use the 0 pixel hack, which if you haven't used it before, if you make this 0 width and 0 height, it's actually going to pin it to the very top of the container, but you can make sure that clip content is unchecked, and it's going to allow you to mess with this now. So doing it this way allows me to create a little baked in gradient without having to mess up my auto layout. So you'll notice that did throw off my spacing, and that's just because I have this all set to fill container, which no longer makes sense. I was doing that to illustrate a point earlier and forgot to change it. So I'm going to come into the grid. I'm going to hit enter to drill down into all of my children like so. And I'm actually going to set this to a fixed height. And I think I can get these cards to be square, which is going to be my goal. Perfect. It does look like we have a little issue with the padding here. And that is just because this is set to hug contents. So this one is much bigger, it's getting pushed up. So what I'm gonna do is actually go into the main component, change this to fill container, and then I will decrease the space in between sections, and that should balance it out. Perfect. So there's another example of how having one main component to make those tweaks is super powerful. Because as I'm kind of figuring out how I want auto layout to work in this example, it's great to be able to make that change once versus realizing I made a mistake and then going through those cards and saying, okay, now I have to set each one of these top frames to fill container. Okay, this is looking good now. So this is step one, is just getting into the habit of creating layouts using a main component as a part of that layout. Before I take it one step further, I want to give you a quick debrief on how I set up my workstation, because it actually is important for this next part. I use a second monitor for everything. I highly recommend getting one if you don't already have one. But the way that I use it is I will do all of my designing up on my monitor, zoomed in, so I can really see the details. But then I'll use a second Figma window on my laptop below to make sure that I'm always previewing my designs at 1x. That way you always have a sense for the big picture as you're designing the finer details. And the reason this is important is because a lot of times when I'm exploring UI, I'm going to be playing with interactive components because I want to see how a design feels as I'm using it. And I'm playing around with clicking on things and testing different hover states. And to me, I feel like that process of exploring is every bit as important as the UI itself. I want to feel those interactions because that's a big part of the experience that I'm creating. So what I'm going to do next is take this workflow one step further and show you what it looks like to create a layout using interactive components and base components. Now for this example, I'm going to pretend that I'm creating a video lesson player where I'm going to have some kind of a group of lessons. So these are individual lessons here. And they're all in a group, and this group can be expanded or collapsed like an accordion. So anytime you have an open and a closed state, right away you know you're going to be dealing with interactive components so that you can use variants. But also this is where it's important to play with your prototype while you're designing, because you want to make sure that that interaction feels right. So what I will do, similar to last time, is I'm going to create a new component. Only I'm actually going to make this a base component of my group. And the reason is because I know that I will have an open state, so I'm going to call that yes, as well as a closed state, so I'm going to call that no. And I'll combine these as variants, call it group. Perfect. And I'm actually going to get rid of this fill and add a border so that it's still kind of easy to see. Now within this individual group, remember I know that I'm going to have these lesson subcomponents. So I'm going to go ahead and create that, where I'm going to say base lesson. I'll add a little bit of a fill so I can see this thing. And then I will duplicate that twice. And I'm just going to have default and hover as my two states. I will combine those as variants, call it lesson. Perfect. Now within my base group, all I have to do is add a little title. So I'll call this group name. Let's give this a fixed width for now. We'll call it 640 pixels. And we'll give it some default padding around. And you can see these changes are automatically reflecting here. And now all I have to do is insert my lesson component directly into the auto layout. So let's make this vertical. We'll set it to hug contents. And again, you can see that's populating everywhere. And I'm just going to create a handful of these lessons and throw them into an auto layout called lessons. And the reason I did that is because now I can come in here and see okay, this one has yes, and this one has no. And this is on the property open. So within no, all I have to do is hide this lessons group, and it's automatically going to decrease my accordion. So let's set both of these to fill container, because I'll probably have some kind of a parent container in my layout that's dictating the width. And you can see it's starting to take shape. I have the basic layout here. So I'm actually going to create a prototype frame that we can use to see how this looks in real time. And I will simply give it my normal background, give it a border so you can see it. And then I'm going to insert a couple of my groups. And I'll throw this into a groups wrapper. Awesome. Now, right away, I know that these two lesson states are going to have some stylistic differences on hover. So I can actually go ahead and do that right now. Maybe this increases in opacity, perhaps. And let's just wire that up so we can start to kind of play with our prototype. Now remember, I would be designing on my monitor, and in real time, I would have this open on my laptop so that I could play with my prototype as I'm actually making changes. So for something like that hover state, I might make the change really quickly up here, but then right away, I want to feel that. I want to see, is this the effect that I want to create? So let's take it one step further and add a little chevron, and we're going to do the open and close state interaction. And the nice thing about having this base component is I only have to make this change once. I'm going to call it a row, set it to fill container, move the chevron over here. Perfect. So let's wire this interaction up then. When it's closed, if you click on it, it goes to open and vice versa. So now I can come back into my prototype and close this whole thing. Pretty nice. So now I already have the basic foundation done. Everything works, it's wired up, and I simply have to come in here and make some style updates and bring this prototype to life so I can see it happening before my eyes and use the prototype as I'm actually designing. So I might have something like a lesson name, and then I'm going to use the Phosphor plugin to get some kind of a play button, perhaps. Maybe that's solid. This is my favorite part, is now that I have the full setup, all of my changes will ripple throughout my different component layouts. So if I drag this play icon in, it appears everywhere. So you can start making changes super fast, and then it's immediately available like so. So I'm not going to spend the next 10 minutes creating a bunch of UI since I've already done that, but I wanted to make sure you saw how you can use interactive components and base components to create the foundation for your designs before you actually start exploring what the visuals could look like. Because right now I have a pretty sweet setup where there's only a few knobs that I have to turn in order to make wide sweeping changes quickly. So I can move more efficiently, but I also have the ability to play with my prototype in real time as I'm making those changes. And then the last benefit is when we move into handoff and actually get to the point where this is ready for engineering to work on it, you know that you would have to create this type of a component setup anyway. And so by doing it up front, you're saving that whole refactoring process. Now let's say that you go a different direction and you don't actually end up using these designs. Is this effort a waste? I don't think so at all. I think this workflow allows you to iterate more quickly by decreasing the amount of places that you have to make changes. And it also speeds up the amount of time that it takes to get your prototype to a lifelike state. We shouldn't just be looking at a prototype after we've created this full UI concept. I'm a big believer in prototyping as you're designing in order to really experience your UI as it comes to life.